Hello, this is Charles Brewer, President of the Civil War Study Group here at Lake of the Woods, Virginia. Welcome to this recording of our program on September 26, 2025. So our speaker today is Dr. Daryl Black, who was last here with us 2 years ago in 2023. He's a long-time student of the Civil War. He has a PhD from the University of California at Irvine, where he taught for a while. He subsequently taught at Auburn University and the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. While trained as an academic, his heart has been in public history, and he's been busy. He's contributed and led museum projects in Chattanooga and most recently at Seminary Ridge Museum in Gettysburg. He and his family reside in Gettysburg. His many writings include essays on memory, the American Revolution, revivalism in antebellum Georgia, and souvenirs at the dedication of Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Military Park. His most recent work has centered on antebellum religious practices, how they shaped the war. And we're about to hear about some of that this morning. So without further ado, I give you Dr. Daryl Black.
All right, I'm going to try to do this without the headphone. I don't like the Madonna look, so it makes me a little uncomfortable to have it on. As long as I can be heard in the back of the room, that's okay. So, okay, good. Volume is up as loud as it goes. I've been interpreting outside for many, many years, so I've developed that National Park Service projection skill. Learned it from Jim Ogden at Chickamauga, and if you've ever seen a tour with him, you can hear him halfway across the field when he starts talking. Before I start talking about where I am in this project, I wanted to thank the group for inviting me down last time. The presentation that I put together was based on sort of my beginnings of thinking about what a big project on religion in Robert E. Lee's Army would look like. I didn't think that it would go very far. I figured I would give some lectures on it, and that would be about that. But I sent the video over to my colleague Ken Noe, who is now the Emeritus Professor of Southern History from Auburn University, great friend, great Civil War historian. And I said, what do you think? Is there something here? And he, within 30 minutes, sent me a long email back that said, yeah, there's a lot there, and you need to do the book now. And I thought, well, great. Now I've got the next 5 years wrapped up in this project. I thank you for that, because I wouldn't have put my thoughts together in the way that I did had I not come to talk to y'all about that. So there's a lot of credit that needs to be given to this group for encouraging me to move on with this project and take it into something bigger than just a couple of presentations. So since I was here last time, I have really dove into the project. I have a manuscript, sort of a brain dump, big chunk of about 600 pages that I'm working through. So I have really taken the bit in my mouth and run with this project after I was here. And this is a story. This is a story of people doing things in a certain time, under certain conditions, based on their beliefs. And what I want to do is tell the story of these people who get wrapped up in a tremendously horrific event, an event that perhaps in the middle of 1860 they couldn't have imagined. And I want to think about how they used intellectual tools and their cultural tools to understand what was going on, and then how they took those traditions and how they took the institutions into the Army. I think we're all fairly familiar with the idea that there was a big revival in the Confederate Army in Robert E. Lee's Army, but that's a vaguely interesting thing to say. There was a revival in the Army. Well, how did this happen? How did religion, which is not necessarily always a part of the military experience, how did that get translated into the Confederate experience? What did it mean for the people who were in the armies, and what did it mean for the communication between people who stayed at the home front and people who were involved in the military action itself? So this is about connectivity. It's about the ways that people made sense out of an incredibly fast-moving and incredibly confusing period of their lives. So, since it's a story, we'll start at the beginning. We'll start in 1860. We'll start at Mercer University. But I'm not going to talk about a soldier. I'm going to talk about a father. I'm going to talk about a man who was a mathematics professor at Mercer University, a fellow named Shelton Sanford. And Shelton Sanford was born in Greensboro, Georgia, about 1817, into a wealthy plantation family. Greene County was the center of the first big cotton boom in the South. It's where Eli Whitney's cotton gin made it possible to grow short staple cotton. So when you think of the Old South, when you think of cotton agriculture, you think of the Old South slave system, it starts in Greene County, it starts in Lincoln County, the areas around Augusta, over into South Carolina, and that's where Shelton Sanford was born. And he was born into a wealthy family, 16 enslaved persons in 1840, 5 or 6 brothers, a couple of sisters, lived in town. His father was evidently, I can't dig too much up on his father yet, but his father was a pretty influential leader in the community. Shelton goes off to Franklin. Well, first off, Shelton is a member of the Greensboro Baptist Church. And Charles mentioned that I'd written an article many years ago about the 1827 revival in Georgia. Well, guess who is in the pews during those revival meetings in 1827 and 1828? It was 12-year-old Shelton Sanford. Shelton Sanford. Gosh, it's a hard one to say. That's an easy one. I know. Say it fast. I might really get in trouble. But so Sanford is in this revival meeting, and I could go way down the rabbit hole on the revival meetings themselves and the way that these revivals unfolded in Georgia. But the important thing to remember is he was right next to Adiel Sherwood, who's given credit for being one of the drivers of that revival in 1827 and 1828. He's also a part of a way of doing revival that's important to keep in mind. Generally, when people think of revivals as big, exciting meetings, people falling down, having the jerks, having the barks, these frontier-style revivals. That's generally what the image that people have in their mind. But in Georgia, in the Cotton Belt, they had a different way of doing things. They had developed under Jesse Mercer, who was one of the most influential Baptists in the entire country at the time. Mercer University. Well, if you're a Georgian, you know a whole lot about Jesse Mercer because he's an incredibly important guy down there. But in any case, Mercer's style of revival was based on his Calvinist faith and his Calvinist theology that dominated the Southern Baptist churches in Georgia. And it was to bring people to a sense of their lostness and then create a profound silence of introspection, of quietude, as you considered your own spiritual state. And in that model, he encouraged conversion. It's not the dramatic experience that we think of. It's a very quiet, introspective, controlled experience of revival. So that's what Shelton Sanford grew up in. And that's what becomes the dominant way of having a revival in Southern churches. And Mercer's influence is tremendous. You see it in the newspapers. You see this style of revivalism all across the South, in the denominational press and the associational minutes, and all of these sources point to Mercer's model being the model that becomes dominant in the South in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. That's where these kids grew up. That's where Shelton Sanford grew up. And it's where his son, Charlie, grew up. It's important to think about Charlie because Charlie was 17 in 1860. He was a sophomore he was a freshman at Mercer University. And Mercer had become one of the state's leading institutions of learning by the beginning of the Civil War. It's founded in 1833, right after the revivals. It partly comes out of that enthusiasm and the really entrenchment of Southern Baptist, the Southern Baptist Church in Georgia. So, Charlie's 17. Shelton Sanford, like most of his neighbors, when the political crisis of 1860 and 61 comes, is a conservative man. 69% of the voters in Greene County, Georgia, voted for John Bell in 1860. 69% conditioned. These are constitutional unionists. They are very uneasy with the idea of secession. They're very uneasy with the idea of breaking up the Union. And they're very unhappy that there might be a war as a result of what's going on politically. Now, you would think that in the pulpits during this political crisis, you'd hear a lot of political sermonizing. Well, guess what's not happening? Because Shelton he's a mathematician. He's been at Mercer since 1839, after he graduates from the University of Franklin College, which is now the University of Georgia. You'd think that he would go to church in November of 1860 and hear sermons about the politics of the day. Not a word. He's a mathematician. He's very meticulous, and he makes notes in his diary every single sermon that he heard over the course of we've got the 1860, 61, 62 diaries. So through that period, he recorded every single sermon that he heard in a quick summation of what was said in the sermon. November 1860, nothing about politics. December 1860, you start to see a little bit of politics, and it's not until the beginning of 1861 that there's a tremendous turn when Georgia is beginning to move towards seceding from the Union, that political sermons begin to be preached in the Baptist churches. And they're really about how God's will is working its way out in the politics of the day, and how these people are going to translate their unionism and their support of the United States to the Confederate States. This is a big lift for these people. And in the beginning of 1861, it is the primary conversation that's going on. Within a week of Lincoln's election, you start to see some movement. And this is Mercer. This is in the Mercer. In the Penfield is where Mercer was. Greensboro is about 10 miles down the road. That's the county seat of Greene County. And there's a big meeting called, a political meeting called, in November 18th. So 10 days after Lincoln's elected. And they get the news that Lincoln's elected. Big political meeting. The three men who run the meeting, or three of the six men who run the meeting, are professors, or the president of Mercer University, and then two professors, including Sanford himself, who serves as the secretary of this meeting. They come up with a set of resolutions, and this is going on all over the South. These meetings are coming together, and they're having these resolutions are being put forward, and they're very conservative. We don't want secession. We want to work towards keeping the Union together. At the very same time that these resolutions are being passed, there are companies of Minutemen, or infantry soldiers, being organized in Greensboro. And by the middle of December, Shelton Sanford himself is conducting drill sessions out in front of the chapel at Penfield at Mercer University with all of the students participating. So there are two things going on, right? They're getting ready for war, but they're sure hoping for peace. And what they are doing and what they're saying, and what Shelton Sanford records in his diary over and over and over, is that I'm anxious about what's happening, but God's will be done. This shouldn't come as any surprise, right? These people have a providential view of the world. They believe that God, in different levels, this guy has a peculiarly Presbyterian version of providence, and we'll talk about him in just a minute. But the Baptists everybody has a providential view of life, some more extreme than others. This guy believes that every single movement that a human makes is ordained by God, and God knew about it before these people were even born. So, I mean, it's an extreme vision of providence. The Baptists have a slightly less rigid form of providential thinking that's involved in how they understand the world. And that's what you see in Sanford's diary. You see him worried. You see him believing that God is going to guide the nation. He's going to guide the South. He's going but he's not going to involve himself in every single movement that somebody makes. So there's a range of providence, but Sanford expresses it very clearly. So you see him talking about God's will is going to be done. I trust that the good Lord is going to take care of us. I trust that this is the right thing. And so you begin to see, and Sanford is a nice exemplar, you begin to see these conservative, constitutional unionists, conditional secessionists, or conditional unionists begin to start moving by the beginning of January in another direction. Because one thing that's very important for the Baptist especially is that you follow the state. The relationship between church and state, in their view, is inviolate. Never should the two get mixed up with each other. And there's some Baptists in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, who don't even think the Confederacy, once things get going, should be appointing chaplains. They think that taking money from the government is the wrong thing for a preacher to be doing. So they send missionaries to the army. And there are plenty of Baptist chaplains, but it's a subset of thinking within the Baptist church about what the relationship between church and state should be. But you begin to see the crisis of the moment seeping into the everyday of what's going on at Mercer. And again, we can see this in Tuskegee, Alabama. I'll talk about the Southwestern Baptist in a few minutes. You can see it in Oxford, Mississippi, where T.D. Witherspoon, I talked about him last time, if you remember, but probably not, but that's beside the point. I'm footnoting myself here. So anyway, this is going on all over the place. This kind of shift in thinking is going on. Now, one of the problems of doing a project like this is finding the primary sources that help you tell the story. And there are not that many sets of letters and diaries that are, Sanford is an extremely rare case. There are not that many people who are specifically religious and really looking at this crisis through a religious lens that exists or that are available for the early part of the war. You see a lot more as we move farther into the war, but at the beginning, it's right now difficult to really kind of get into that nitty-gritty, fine-grained detail with individuals. And so what I've depended on for this first chapter of the book, this first Sanford story, because it's so perfect, it's like it lined up. I don't know. It's one of the most unusual documents I've ever come across, and I found it at Emory University when I was doing my dissertation research. Because I was stopped in 1844, I couldn't use it. So it's been sitting in my files for 30 years now, and I can finally come back and use this incredibly rich document. So Sanford gives us a great view into that personal struggle. And remember, his son's 17, and he teaches young men. He's drilling these young men. We know what Shelton Sanford's thinking. And it starts to play out in the beginning of January, into February. His students are going off and joining the Army. They're going back to their home counties and joining the Army. Or they're going down to Greensboro and they're joining the Army. And his senior class goes away. His junior class, by the end of 1861, is all gone. And he's standing there looking at his son, knowing that Charlie is going to end up in the Army. So, enough on those guys. Let's shift our gears a little bit. This is Robert Louis Dabney. He's in Virginia. He is the president of Union Theological Seminary at Hampden-Sydney. Some of you may know that he ends up as Stonewall Jackson's chief of staff from April of 1862 to the end of the 7 Days battles. He gets sick and goes home and almost dies during that experience. So he's associated with Stonewall Jackson himself. Interestingly, he was a staunch Unionist. In the late 1850s, he's writing newspaper articles, he's writing tracts about how it's a bad idea to secede, how secession is a terrible idea, how the Union has protected the interest of Southern slaveholders for all of these years, and that this is something, oh my gosh, something we ought not be doing. And when secession begins to unfold in January of 1860, Dabney gives a sermon that is then published. He gives a sermon in mid-January that's published by the end of January, and it's a pretty good one. I'll read a few pieces. I generally don't do this, but it's called A Pacific Appeal to the Christians, or to Christians. Let us then study moderation of political sentiments, of resentment of language. Let us keep a watch before the door of our lips, lest some needless words issue forth to exasperate what is already too angry. Let us see to it that we do not initiate the sin, nor share the guilt of those who have perverted sacred influences of Christianity to sanctify malignant feeling. Is disunion, civil war before us? A civil war whose atrocities may appall the world. The wisest hearts admit the fear. Let each man then place himself now, before it is too late, in the midst of the possible horror of this fratricidal war. Let him bring before his mind a country ravaged, its fields, late smiling in plenty, stained by battle and the carnage of fellow citizens and brethren of a common Christianity. So this is published in January of 1860. Because Dabney is the leader of the Presbyterian Church in Virginia, he knows all the folks who are influencers in the Presbyterian Church. And after the sermon is published, after the sermon is given, he circulates it amongst the very influential Presbyterians in Virginia to get their opinion. And there is an addendum to the published sermon that includes this: the signatures of the leading Presbyterians of Virginia. These are the people, or some of them, I don't want to read them all because it's a long list. So, Samuel Wilson, Doctor of Divinity, Professor of Union Seminary; John Atkinson, President of Hampden-Sydney College; Reverend William Brown, Editor of the Central Presbyterian, probably the most influential Presbyterian newspaper in the United States, or in the southern states at the time; Drury Lacey. We know Drury, right?
No.
Yeah, we do. Yeah, we do. His house is right down the road. The Lacey Mansion. Yeah. This is father. That's their father. Drury is the father. Anyway, he signs this thing. And then there are others. William Nelson Pendleton. We all know that name, right? Chief of Artillery for Robert E. Lee's army and Lee doppelganger. William White of the Lexington Presbyterian Church. That's Stonewall Jackson's preacher and one of his best friends. Father of a famous Confederate officer killed at the Battle of Second Manassas, whose death and the prayer service they had before the second day's fighting became legendary in 1862. It becomes an exemplar of what the Christian Confederate soldiers should look like, and is known within the Army within just a few weeks of this cobbled together prayer service in the Stonewall Brigade. So that's his son. And then you've got a few more. John T. Preston of Washington College, and T.J. Jackson, professor at the Virginia Military Institute. Jackson joins the Presbyterian Church in 1853, becomes a staunch supporter of Presbyterian causes, especially missionary causes, which the next few chapters, we'll get to that. We'll get, the next time I come down here, I'll have that all written up. But Jackson's experience in supporting these missionary agencies comes into play in the winter of 1862 and the beginning of 1863 down at Post Oak Church, down near Fredericksburg. Now, there are people who dissent from that overall view. A group from Davidson College, they sort of give a dissenting opinion on that sermon, and they say that the North has already created too many problems, and that we're going to continue on with preparing for war. So even within the larger context of things, there is plenty of opportunities for dissent. Now, let's turn our attention for a few minutes to the newspapers, because the newspapers are incredibly rich sources for understanding what's going on, because these are the opinion makers of the day. The denominational newspapers are very popular, they're very well supported, and they are widely read at the time. And so, what is the denominational press saying? Well, they're not saying much about politics until the beginning of 1861. You don't see anything. It's all denominational news. It's all the association met here. Here's a good way of being a better Christian. Just the regular, normal, everyday kinds of material that you would assume that you'd see in a denominational newspaper. But things after South Carolina secedes, and then conventions are called in other southern states, they start paying attention, and more of the newspaper columns are taken up with military news, with news of organization, and with advice to the soldiers about how to act in camp and things like that. But the first time that you really begin to see the newspapers participating in what's going on is in January of 1861. So it's January 9th. President Buchanan calls for a national day of prayer and fasting in hopes of averting any more states going out of the Union. Remember, this is January 9th, so it's before anybody else but South Carolina goes out. What did the newspapers say? Well, fortunately, we have quite a few selections to draw from. Let's see. I think I got my next one. Oh, I went the wrong one. I've got it upside down. Charles, you didn't say if I held it upside down, I would go the wrong way. So, let's see. I don't want to go to the Southwestern Baptist yet. I want to go to the Biblical Recorder. It's published in Raleigh, North Carolina. It's the Baptist newspaper. It's the official newspaper of the North Carolina Baptist Convention. And they said about that day of fasting and prayer, they don't know to what extent or with what spirit Friday last was observed by the people of our excited and distracted land. The editors were not hopeful. We fear that our fellow citizens and fellow Christians throughout this country are too much divided in views, designs, and feelings to authorize the belief that our prayers went up to God with the agreement and earnestness with which He has promised to hear and regard with favor. When Jonah preached that Nineveh would soon be overthrown, the king and the people all humbled themselves and repented in sackcloth. There was a general conviction of guilt, a universal apprehension of evil, and therefore a common feeling of humiliation and prayer. So the Baptists in North Carolina don't think that there has been sufficient contrition shown, that everybody's stirred up by what's happening and they're not paying attention to God's voice. That's a pretty despairing view, don't you think? And this is in North Carolina. See, North Carolina Christian Advocate. They're a little bit more upbeat. North Carolina Christian Advocate is the Methodist newspaper for North Carolina. What did they report? They reported that in accordance with the request of the President of the United States, last Friday was observed as a day of fasting humiliation, and prayer for the preservation of the peace and unity of the country. All across Raleigh, businesses were suspended, the churches were opened, and there was at least the appearance of general and devout humiliation before the God of nations. In the Methodist Church which we attended, we had no political sermons nor harangues, but all seemed to unite with solemnity and in favor in prayer for divine interposition to save the country from the impending peril. There was a tone of sadness and despondency pervading the exercises, which betrayed the deep sense of threatening evils. All left the sanctuary with a stronger purpose to trust in the Lord of hosts and to discharge the duty of citizens with prudence, firmness, and patriotism. And that's the North Carolina view. Maybe we haven't gotten this right. Maybe we haven't been pious enough. Maybe we haven't done enough, not been contrite enough. Methodists say, but people are really serious. What we see, there's a dedication to seeing God's hand in guiding us away from war. These guys have a different view. The Southwestern Baptist, on the same day, on January 9th, publishes an article not about the day of prayer and fasting that Buchanan has asked for, but they're praying for somebody else. They're praying for something else. And what are they praying for? Well, we know that Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama, and who else? Yeah, Florida, Alabama, and Mississippi, and Georgia have all convened their conventions to consider secession. Now, the Southwestern Baptist is published in Tuskegee, Alabama. It is the Baptist newspaper. It's the official paper of the Alabama Baptist Convention. Tuskegee is in the middle. It's just a little bit south of Auburn, Alabama, in the plains, in the flat grounds where cotton agriculture had taken off in the 1830s after the Creek Indians had been dispossessed of their land. So this is new Cotton Belt. Mercer's old Cotton Belt, this is new Cotton Belt. Let's see. So instead of having the meeting that the president wanted, they were asking for prayers in a different way. They're happy that God is being represented through prayer in the conventions that have been called in the other states that are preparing to consider secession. Let's see. They urge their readers, quote, to pray Almighty God to direct the deliberations of these conventions by his own blessed wisdom, to inspire their delegates with discreet firmness to disconnect erroneous or evil counsel, so that in the grand result his name will be glorified, the cause of Zion advanced, and the peace, prosperity, and happiness of our whole country, north and south, abundantly promoted. The glorified Redeemer has some wonderful achievement in reserve for his people and of this generation, and it is not subjecting their faith to this ordeal which is essential to the work. What's happening? They're sacralizing the state. They're blending their faith with the new Confederacy. This is the first time you see it in the paper. Here we are together. The Confederacy is going to promote the cause of Zion. And this becomes an increasingly popular and accepted way of looking at what is coming. Let's stick with the Southwestern Baptist for just a minute. So they publish an article, another really important one, that's really marking some important changes. They publish an article, I think it's the day after, it's January 10th, no, it's the next week, January 17th, sorry. I've got the date right here. They publish an article looking back at 1860. And they're trying to help people figure out what in the world is going on. And they look back at the history of 1860, and they claim that the prophecy of Revelation is being unfolded in the world, not just in the United States, but in the revolutions in Europe, in Garibaldi's efforts to create a republic in Italy. Now, these people are really in tune with what's going on internationally. These aren't crackers from way back in the country. These are very sophisticated thinkers and people who are engaged with large conversations about what republican government is and should look like. So they're concerned with what's happening in South America. They're looking at God himself is fulfilling the prophecies of the book of Revelation by directing a rapid transformation from Garibaldi's campaigns to create republican government on the Italian peninsula, to the nationalist politics in Japan and China, to the ongoing anti-colonial revolution in South America, and the turmoil caused by France's attempt to recolonize Mexico. The Confederacy is not existing in, or what's going to become the Confederacy, doesn't exist in a vacuum. The political discord of 1860 and 1861 is a part of God, and they say he's unsealing the prophecies. He's breaking the seals of prophecy, which means he's taking it from prophetic to actual. And that God is guiding this movement. And what's happening in the South is God's expression of his will in a larger movement across the world. Again, this is something that begins to pick up steam as you go along. Let's see. When the North nominated a sectional candidate for the presidency and elected him against the remonstrances of another section, little did they think that they were opening a seal that would produce so great a political earthquake. What's happening is God's will. So let's see. Hang on, I just messed myself up here. So I want to stick with the newspapers for a few minutes. One of the things that I've been able to do, and I'm going to wrap this up fairly quickly here. One of the things that I've been able to do is use machine learning, or AI, to help sort through all of this material. When you have 500 sermons and tracts, you need a little bit of help. And I don't have graduate students working for me, so AI works really nicely in sorting this material for me. It's been I've done a very small sample of this stuff, but what I've gotten back is profoundly helpful, and it helps me see through lines and trends. Remember, in the drafting phase of this project right now, I'm only up to July of 1861. I have purposely stopped just literally the day before the Battle of First Manassas. So what do we see in these newspapers? What are the themes that have developed or are developing? And I asked the AI to help me figure out, what are they trying to do with thinking about, I've got my notes out of order, thinking about secession, thinking about slavery, thinking about providence, thinking about abolition, and what their mobilization practices are. Those were the questions that we put to AI to look for commonalities across time. And we can see some pretty interesting trend lines established. And I'm sorry, I've got my notes out of order, so I'm just going to stick with the biblical recorder, because that kind of stands in, that's the Baptist newspaper in North Carolina, and it stands in, they're pretty common all the way across the board. There's some subtle differences, but this is how the biblical recorder, the Baptist newspaper, looked at secession. War was inevitable due to Northern policy. So they're making this a defensive war, and that's the only war that the Christians can justify. And you see this beginning to play out in 1861, especially in the sermons that are being given to the soldiers who are going off to fight. We're not fighting for glory. We're not fighting to conquer. We're defending ourselves. And God in the Bible says it's okay to fight a war in self-defense. Very important and a very common theme across time, or across 1861. Interestingly, I finds that North Carolinians were celebrating secession even before North Carolina secedes. So we think of North Carolina just making a quick turn after Fort Sumter and Lincoln's call for troops, but they're already in January, February, getting ready to secede in organizing military companies and thinking about becoming a part of what's coming. They don't know yet, but they're looking at what's coming. They also urge patience and unity. Again, this is a common theme across all the newspapers, is that you need to be patient with this. Let this play out. Let God's will play out, and everything's going to be okay. Stay calm. Slavery. Every one of the newspapers, we can say the same things. Front page articles promoting doctrinal rigor in terms of God's approval of slavery. One of the things that's interesting is there are two crisis moments where you see a lot of sermons and a lot of publications that really address the issue of slavery and the centrality of slavery to the Confederate nation. One is in the winter and spring of 1861, and one is in the period from August of 1863 to the end of 1863. Crisis moments, right? Everything's gone haywire in August of 1863, and sermons are being given and published that remind the Confederate soldiers what they're fighting for. So you've got a lot of this in these winter and spring of 1861 newspaper articles. They're also looking at what their providence means and how they can tap into providence. This is another thing that runs through. So this providential view of history. So they're asking for days of fasting and prayer. There are articles like "The Lord Reigneth," and it explains how providence works and how we should be submissive to providence. It's one of the articles that comes out of the Biblical Recorder. They're praying for peaceful separation. Remember, this is January, February, March 1861. They're hoping that things can be done without a war, but they're also saying if a war comes, we're justified. So they're trying to prepare for peace, but at the same time, they are preparing for war. And again, this is something, because there's a long period of revival, excitement, and enthusiasm in the southern states in the late 1850s. And they pray that the articles are saying that they want that revival to continue on. And that's really important, because there's already, even before there are any soldiers in the field, these newspapers and these denominational leaders are thinking about how, if there is a war and if there are large armies, how are we going to continue this revival there in the army? They're already making plans for this. They're tapping into and they begin to tap into the structures of the churches, the colporteurs in the Baptist church, which are individuals who take religious literature around and give out to people. Missionaries. We're going to send people out to tend to the spiritual needs of the soldiers in the field. We're going to create, through publications with tracts and published sermons and newspapers, a connection back home, and maintain what one newspaper calls a spiritual life. I think it's a spiritual lifeline. You get the point. To serve these soldiers who may or may not be in the army, but probably we're going to end up in a war, and we're probably going to need to be ready to mobilize all of our efforts to proselytize these soldiers and provide them a familiar context. They start having prayer meetings every Wednesday across the South. Everybody's supposed to they ring the bells and everybody goes to church to pray for the soldiers. The soldiers are doing the same thing. Prayer is early in the war. Prayer is being used to connect people at home and in the army. And when the soldiers get to camp, that's their first recourse, because things aren't very well organized. There are not a lot of chaplains. There are some, but there are not a lot of chaplains. There never are. There's never more than half the army served by chaplains throughout the entire 4 years of the existence of Robert E. Lee's army. So they depend on these missionaries. I almost said mercenaries. Here's a prayer book. Now these guys, this is stuff that's being published very, very early, and this is spring of 1861. You got to be pretty elite as far as being a military organization, if you have your own prayer book. You know, that's the 1st South Carolina Rifles, and they have their own prayer book. Sermons. Now there's two distinct, these things start making their way into the Army very early on. They're published. This is a sermon that was given to 2 companies that are going off from northwest Georgia to join the 8th Georgia Infantry, Anderson's brigade, heavy fighting, hard fighting Confederate unit. This thing is all about slavery. This is all. There are 36 different references to slavery and the cause of the South being wrapped up together in this sermon. And this is what those guys from the Miller Guards and the Miller Rifles and the Rome Light Guards are hearing when they go off to fight. They get on the train the next day and they're off to Virginia. These sermons they're delivered, and then they're published. This was published at request of the 2 companies. And then if you look, and if we could open it up, we would see that the Reverend Jones has written he's kept a copy of it, and he wrote on the front page in 1862, "I want to keep this so my son will know the real cause of the war." So the sermons that we see, by and large, I would say 80% of the sermons that I've read so far, and I'm in the 100 or so sermons at this point, 80% of them are these pro-slavery, biblical defense of slavery. The nation is justified by God to continue on supporting slavery. And again, they're kind of concentrated early and then in the middle part of the war. But by and large, this is the most pervasive literature that shows up in the Army. And these are tracts. There's not a word in them about slavery. There's not a word in them about politics. These are old style, get saved, get right with the Lord kind of stuff. I've seen at least 350 of these. I've run a bunch of them through AI. Not a word about slavery. This is all about getting saved. So religion's working on different levels in the Army itself. And that's the end of the slideshow. So what's happening? So there's a lot that I haven't said. You know, these guys get to the Army and they're really unhappy about the lack of attention to religion. And they start making calls for these regular kinds of things that they're used to having happen. And the soldiers themselves are calling for chaplains and missionaries to come to the Army, for colporteurs to come and provide religious literature. They call these tracts a preacher in your pocket. You know, the influence of a preacher giving one sermon is one thing, but having that written down and having that path to salvation written down and in your pocket is entirely different. And they know this. They know that these publications are taking the place of sermons that could be given in camps. And that call comes from the soldiers, because early on they are kind of on their own in a lot of cases. 60-70% of these early regiments and companies don't have chaplains. So the colporteurs who are delivering those tracts, let's see if I can actually make the backup work so we can look at that are delivering these tracts are become incredibly important. So what's going on? Let's jump to the end of this, because the end of this is before the fighting gets really started. What has happened and what's going forward? Again, what I've been talking about is all before the Battle of First Manassas. And everything that I've been focused on for the last 8 months has been before the First Battle of Manassas. So by the end of the summer of 1861, we can see with all these newspapers and all of these, the few individual accounts that we have, that first the Southern religious mind had been turned towards supporting the Confederacy by the beginning of May 1861. There's very little dissent, if any. There's also a strong correlation between identifying the slave-based social system and what these soldiers are doing. It's really simple. And also, they are seeing themselves as God's instrument on earth to bring about the right form of Republican government. So they're secularizing, making holy the Confederate nation because that's God's will for the world. They're not seeing themselves as just defend. There are many instances where they're holding themselves up as exemplars to the world. This is what real Republican government should look like. A slave-based Republican system is the right Republican system. Garibaldi, you don't have it quite right. You're a hero, but you don't have it quite right. Revolutionaries in Europe, you've got the idea right. The people should rule, but the people who should rule. Okay. Print material floods the camps. The structures that are introduced in early 1861 to create the later revivals that start after the Battle of Sharpsburg are in place by the middle of 1861. Print materials flooding the camp. Missionary inculpators are visiting the army. They're staying in the hospitals. They're meeting people at the railroad stations. They're in the camps. And they provide these gaps. They fill these gaps where their chaplain's not in service. Chaplaincy then becomes, by May of 1860, believe it or not, the chaplaincy in the Confederate Army is not created until May of 1861. And even that legislation is introduced by T.R.R. Cobb. That legislation was not popular. And it was unpopular because the guys who were going to be chaplains weren't getting paid enough. Remember, these are UVA, UNC, Southern Baptist Seminary, Columbia Seminary. I mean, these guys are not backwoods preachers. These guys are socially connected. They have families, and they're used to a certain lifestyle. And then the money that they were going to be paid was not enough for them to go out and risk life and limb preaching to the soldiers. And they thought it was an insult. And it goes on. There's a debates in the newspaper that go way on into November of 1861 talking about what an insult this is to the chaplains in religion by underpaying them and not providing them forage. I mean, the law is really kind of funny when you think about it. But by the end of 1861, things have changed enough that the denominations have stepped in to pick up some of the slack in payment. They're using missionaries. And so you begin to see more chaplains and more regular services happening in the armies by the end of 1861. And I think one of the most interesting things that I've come across is that the denominations look at the soldiers' camps like they're camp meetings. Camp meetings are a regularized form of revival. There are campgrounds all over the South where people on a regular basis, once or twice a year, go for a week of preaching and being around your friends. So the denominations see these as camp meetings. And the soldiers begin to act like they're camp meetings in a lot of cases. And that lays the foundation for what happens in the fall of 1861 and all the way through the end of the war. They look at it as a mission field. There are guys who were getting ready to go off to Japan and China to be missionaries, J. William Jones and Crawford Toy. They decide very quickly that this is a more important mission field than going abroad. And so they end up as chaplains in Lee's army and serve throughout the war. Jones is probably the most famous of Lee's chaplains. Something else that's going on is that by the end of 1861 is that pious officers, colonels, lieutenant colonels, captains, who are religious men themselves, begin to see themselves as examples for their young men around them. And they're going to serve as positive Christian examples to these people. They're going to promote prayer. They're going to promote prayer meetings. They're going to promote reading of religious literature. They're going to promote not cussing and not drinking and not playing cards, all the things that mark you off as a good, pious person. Those are the officers. So you get the leader. Remember, these are communities at war. Every company is a local organization. These people know each other. and they know what's going to happen. And so the last thing I want to mention is that the soldiers themselves, in the gaps that exist in 1861, are organizing themselves. They're having prayer meetings, they're having singing services in the camps, they're going to other camps where there are chaplains to hear sermons. And that lays the groundwork for what becomes more famous as the revival in the Confederate armies around here. I mean, it happens here in the spring of 1863 with Stonewall Jackson and the Chaplains Association. But to get there, to get to that moment where Jackson organizes everything, there had to be steps taken in the interim that maintained that connection to home and the familiar context of religious dedication amongst Lee soldiers. Thank you. I'm happy to answer questions as long as y'all want to talk. Oh, okay, David.
Thank you, Daryl.
You're welcome.
First comment and then a question
Okay.
is, just so anybody here feels guilty that they did not remember Pastor Witherspoon's name from before. As you well know, he was pastor to my great-great-grandfather.
That's right.
Brother, and I didn't remember his name either.
Okay, that's fair. That's fair.
Okay.
Is he one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence?
I don't know. They're Mississippi. I don't know what the heritage is.
Princeton. There we go.
Yeah.
My question is, Jefferson Davis was a graduate of West Point.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
He commanded, I think, the 1st Mississippi Rifles during the Mexican War.
Yes.
He was Secretary of War.
Right.
So he well understood the importance of offensive operations and warfare
Okay.
if you want to prevail. Right? Yet, the South adopted a leave us alone, we'll defend our society and so forth.
Yeah.
Any indication that his decision to do that was because of this influence down below amongst the populace that it's God's will that we defend.
Yeah. That's a great question.
We cannot attack.
Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't come across it specifically, but it makes logical sense. But at the same time, his generals think that they need to be offensive, and they're very, it's Jackson and Lee. I haven't given that a whole lot of thought. It's something to consider. Davis himself was not an especially pious guy before the war started. And I actually start the first chapter of the book with Davis's inauguration and the presence of Basil Manley, who was one of the most influential Baptists in the entire South, at the First Confederate Congress. He was the chaplain of the First Confederate Congress, and gives the invocation at Davis's inauguration. And he actually, Manley actually rides in the carriage with Davis and Alexander Stephens to the service, or excuse me, to the inauguration. It's very clear his inaugural speech is not a barn-burning, rip-roaring sermon. It's a lot about fighting a defensive war. We don't want to have a war. But he finishes with some references back to the prayer that Manley had given at the beginning of the ceremony, and it's very clear that the Confederate Congress was especially interested in making sure that religion was highlighted in the formation of the Confederacy, which is why the most prominent Baptist in the entire South is at the right hand of Davis and Stephens that day, and had been at the First Confederate Congress. I mean, it's widely reported in the newspapers. It's reported in the New York Herald. The New York Herald says that the prayers that Manley gives show that this is a Christian nation. They're very laudatory. The Harrisburg newspaper says similar things about how respectable this new nation is and their dedication to God. And of course the Southern newspapers play it up pretty big too. But Davis knows, even though he's not an especially pious guy in 1861, he knows how important religion is broadly in the South. He immediately begins issuing calls for days of prayer and humiliation and fast days. You know, that's an old New England thing. You know, that's a New England way kind of thing. That goes back to the Puritans, that tradition. But Davis issues, I think he issues 22 over the course of the war, just 4 years. You know, it seemed like every other month they were having a day of prayer and humiliation. You know, there's nothing that I've seen that directly connects Davis to promoting a defensive war because he sees it as being acceptable to the Southern population, but it kind of makes sense. And it certainly highlights, and it certainly gave me an opportunity to talk about how Davis and how the Confederate Congress are publicly using religion. Now, I mean, they're not misusing, but they're using religion to communicate something to the people who are going to go out and fight the battles. Yes?
What was the main thrust of the biblical defense of slavery?
Yeah, the most famous part of it is the sons of Ham. And it's Noah curses Ham, and Ham goes off, and then there's this teleological leap that they make between Ham, who's been cursed, servant among servants for all your life. The way that the Southern theologians look at it is that is a general curse on the people of Africa. That's the most, you know, God, he said people in Africa are slaves and white people are not. There's a tremendous literature, both secular and religious, that focuses on that Sons of Ham. I read a book a book published in 1862 about race in the South, and it uses both the curse of Ham and scientific evidence to demonstrate the inferiority of black people and the necessity of controlling them through slavery. And this is what the central core of both religious and secular thinking is in what becomes the Confederacy. They also use other biblical texts. They say that Jesus never said anything bad about slavery. He had every. I know it's funny sounding, but he had every opportunity to speak out against slavery, and he never did. So they use a negative example with Christ. Then they use Paul and Onesimus. Paul tells Onesimus to go back. Onesimus is a slave who's run away from his master, and Paul says, no, you have to give the subjection that's due you to your master. You have to go back to your master. So they're positive theological reasons. There are examples in the New Testament that are being used, and then there are kind of these stretches that are made to connect it all together. But it was dominant. I mean, it was, you know, I've read the capstone sermons, the capstone class at the University of Georgia for 1860, and it was given by the president of the college, and his name was Patrick Hughes Mell, a leading Baptist minister, one of the most popular of the pro-slavery. I mean, in the Baptist, the Biblical Recorder in 1860-61. There are Mell's articles and his sermons about pro-slavery are being published on the front page of that paper. So his currency in articulating what pro-slavery was all about was pretty well known and pretty popular. Patrick Hughes Mell ends up organizing a Confederate company from the University of Georgia, where he had taught the capstone class, which is a moral philosophy class. And the whole moral philosophy class is demonstrating the superiority of slave society over free society. And that's the capstone senior class for these guys that are going to go out and be political and social and cultural leaders. Mell gets sick. He can't go off to the army, but his son goes off and is killed at South Mountain. You know, Athens is pretty dang Confederate, and those UGA students certainly get involved. But very much under the influence of Mell and very much under the influence of his thinking and teaching.
If you haven't watched it, there's a great courses.
My book is
course on a new history of the American South.
Mm-hmm.
have you watched it? 'Cause
I have not, no.
One of the episodes talks about the revivalism in the South.
Yeah.
It starts in the early 1800s.
Right.
It's like 1816.
Yeah, there's a big revival, the Great Revival. John Bowles calls it. It's 1802, 03, and then there's another round in 1816, and then there's a big slave hold. So those are sort of on the periphery and
they
in the
include
frontier.
the slaves in the revival.
Yes, they do, and that's one of the things that's driving me crazy right now. I know for a fact that black and white people worship together in most of those rural churches. But I can't find, I've only found 2 mentions of black men participating in religious ceremonies in the camps. We know that there are 1,000, there's 1,500, 2,000 enslaved people with Lee's army or more, but the fact that they're not, that I can't find, it drives me crazy, because that was the normal, the normality or the normalcy of biracial worship. How does that, so I'm arguing that the context of Southern evangelicalism are being transferred into the Army, but I still can't see how that's working. One of the sources that I found suggests that there is some of that old style biracialism going on in the camps, because there's a Lutheran minister from a North Carolina regiment who's been asked to baptize several guys who'd converted. This is in spring of '63, and he mentions one of the camp slaves being baptized that day with them. So they're being baptized together, just the same way that they had been participating in church services before the war. So yeah, that's going to be hard to get at. The other thing that's absent is this movement of this transfer of these structures into the Army is not complete, and it's not 100%. I've not seen enough of this biracialism. The other thing that's missing is the women's influence. Sheldon Sanford's wife was a Bostonian, moved to the South, was a singing teacher, and led the choir at the Penfield Church, and also taught Sunday school. Sanford himself was the Sunday school director at the church. They worked together. And young men were used to having their mothers instruct them in religious things and lead them. If you look at the roles of the churches, there are a lot more women in a lot of cases than men who are full members of the churches. And women's responsibility was to nurture that inner sense of spirituality. And so these guys are often in a totally male environment. They don't have that same kind of influence going on. And so one of the questions that I have is how does that change things? How does that change the nature of how these guys relate to Christianity in the church? And so I'll dig into that, especially as I'm able to do more research on private soldiers and individuals in the ranks, because that's where I'm going to get the evidence that's showing, what is the absence of that women's influence going to have in the camps. So. But yeah, but the biracialism is driving me nuts. I talked to Kevin Levine about it. I was like, did you come across, when you were doing your book on black Confederates, did you come across anything like this? And he said, I never even thought about it, but I never saw it.
Yeah, this particular episode in that great course touches on the women in the church.
Yeah, it's really interesting, because you can look at the best example I know, and I saw the hand back there. I'll come to you in a second. During the Seminole War, there are no chaplains. People are being made fun of by the Georgia regiments for going to church. There's not that huge of an influence. At West Point, there is an attempt to get the officers who are coming into the Army to become religious men. That's where Lee and Jackson really, I can't think of the guy's name, Totten, I think was the superintendent of West Point that gave all this religious instruction and really kind of kicked Jackson's religious seeking out. Jackson gets really involved he visits the Bishop of Mexico City and tries to become he thinks he may become a Catholic, and then he becomes a Methodist, and he didn't like that. And then he gets to Lexington and he becomes a Presbyterian. But I'm not sure what my point. This is. I can talk myself out of anything at this point. So
I said I've got a suggestion and a question.
Yeah.
My question is, how will your epilogue to your book deal with how the South accepted the idea that this was God's will, that they lose the war?
Yeah.
And
Well,
it's
that's a
God's
heck of a
will that
question.
The Republic is the northern version of what the Republic
That's a great
is.
question. And so, how they did it is that and this is baked in from the beginning. You know, this whole issue of private piety and not being pious enough and not being subjecting yourself properly to God's authority, then you're going to be punished. So corporate and individual sin is what led to defeat, not God's judgment on the Confederacy, not God's judgment on slavery, but this was because of the moral failings and the spiritual failings of individuals and then together as a people. That's how they explain it. To me, it's a little slippery. You know, if they argue that if you know God's will is being played out and this nation state founded on slavery has lost, the next logical step for me is, well, maybe God was judging our system.
Well, and if Baptists said everything's preordained.
Yes, and it's preordained. It's a tricky one because you gotta take what they're saying at face value because that's what they believe. That's what they believe. That's what when things are going bad, it's not because the Yankees are better army or better led or we didn't fight really good. It's because we weren't praying enough, and God is passing judgment on us for not praying enough. So,
One more question, please.
yes, in the back.
Okay.
Oh.
All right. Were there any conscientious objectors on the Confederate side for religion?
Not that I've come across. You know, there's a coercive nature to what it was to be in the South at the time. I mean, our most famous conscientious objector in World War II was a Tennessean. You know, and I can't think of his name right now. Everybody knows it. There's a movie about it. Coolidge, Charles Coolidge. He's a Tennessean. So there is the denominations and the organizations that tended to be pacifists were gone from the South. There are no Quakers, right? There are no Quakers. The UCC is not down there. You know, the places where you would think that you would see that influence. I haven't come across any yet. But I'll keep an eye. I'm keeping an eye out for that. I'm keeping an eye out for women. I'm keeping an eye out for black soul or black worship together, because that would be an incredibly interesting sidelight to take. But there's a lot of one of the things that revisiting 1861 has done for me is that it reminds me how much violence was a part of, just like in the American Revolution. We don't like to talk about the extra-legal violence that preceded the American Revolution and burning down people's houses and tarring and feathering people for their political views. The same thing's going on in the Confederacy, but they're lynching people. There are multiple lynchings in Clark County, Athens, Georgia, for very specific political reasons. And the Democratic newspaper reports it in every other day. Every other week it seems like. Talking about so-and-so was, he was shooting his mouth off about the Union. Well, we hung him. And they're very matter of fact about it. It's crazy how that extra legal violence. So being a conscientious objector would put you at physical risk in a lot of these places. So there are two other questions, and if I can do them quick, I will.
In your scholarly research, did you find any evidence of the tenor of this religious justification inside of the writings of the state's individual secession letters?
I haven't thought about that. I don't know, but I need to look. I mean, it's a good question. It's a little bit beyond the scope of what I'm trying to do, but it's a really good question for an origin story. And I may need to put that in that first chapter where what I'd want to do is establish how important religion was to the state, and then explain how they got there. So I start with the inauguration and Basil Manley, talk about the Congress, and then I jump back to 1740 and say because the transition is it hadn't always been this way, and then do 30 pages or so on the development of religion in the South. But that's a good one. That's a good approach. Thank you. That's a question that needs to be answered in that first chapter. So, last question over here.
Were there any Catholics involved?
Oh gosh, yeah.
Because right up here,
A ton of them.
where our St. Patrick's Church is,
Yeah.
right off of
Yeah.
Shelley's,
Yeah.
Fork Road, they did masses
Yeah.
there
Yeah.
outside for the Union troops.
Right. There are a lot of Catholics in Mobile. So in the 10th Alabama, you got a lot of Catholics. In all of the Louisiana regiments, in Hayes's Brigade, Nichols' Brigade, a lot of Catholics and a lot of Catholic priests. One of the best diaries of a chaplain comes from James Sheeran, who was the chaplain of the 1st Louisiana Brigade. And let me tell you, he has nothing good to say about Protestants at all. He doesn't want to go. He thinks they're all apostate. He thinks they're heretic. He tells Jubal early, "No, I'm not going to the Chaplains Association meeting because they can't teach me anything, and they sure don't want to hear anything from me. And besides, they're all heretics." So yes, there's a lot, and there's some really good recent scholarship that's come out on Confederate Catholics, and I'm not sure if I buy the argument. I can't think of the title of the book. I think it's called Confederate Catholics. From Kent State University Press. He makes the argument that Catholics, because they're trying to prove themselves at two levels as Confederates and not bad religious people, that they become a little bit more advanced Confederates. That they are a little bit more Confederate than others because they're trying to prove themselves in a context that had been very anti-Catholic. There's a whole political party. The Know Nothing Party is a super hyperactive anti-Catholic. There were fears in the United States in the 1840s and 50s that the Catholics who were migrating from Germany and other parts of Europe in the 1840s were setting up a kingdom for the Pope in the Mississippi River Valley. So being Catholic was pretty dang risky in a lot of places. And so what this guy argues is that Catholics in the South were even more Confederate than anybody else. I think that's a little bit of an overstatement, but I certainly understand the logic behind drawing that conclusion. And I know that Sheeran and others are having mass in the camps all of the time. But they think of themselves very distinctively different than all the Protestants, all those heretics over there.
Well, thank you very much,
Thank you.
Dr. Black. Before you go, please remember to visit our website often, civilwarstudygroup.org. We make every attempt on a regular basis to provide informative content. Thank you for visiting, and God bless.